Hello and welcome to another episode of Focus On, happening from the 16th U.S. Africa Business Summit with myself, Fifi Peters. Now, the summit is the brainchild of the Corporate Council for Africa, who have been facilitating partnerships between U.S. and African companies for the past 30 years. In this episode, we will be speaking with Florizal Lize, who is the president of the Corporate Council of Africa, about those historic ties and, of course, the future relations between companies in Africa and the U.S. Just at the heads of state level, I recall in the previous summits, there has been a larger turnout of the heads of state from the continent. Notwithstanding the fact that there's a lot going on in the world right now, a lot of pressing challenges that perhaps many of them are facing, a lot of elections that many of them are facing. I just wonder if there was an expectation for more.
Well, we invite, first of all, a select list of heads of state. We can't invite all of the African heads of state, largely because we're not the African Union and we're not the United Nations. And so we narrowed it down, and we only invited about 22 in the first place. So the fact that we had 5 out of the 22 that we invited, and we had a few heads of state who had actually confirmed, and then based on some things that were happening in their home countries, they were not able to come at the last minute. So I think at one point we had about 7 that were supposed to be coming, but we ended up with 5. We feel very good about that. There are no other business summits, right, that can say that they had that many African heads of state that came. And so, we had probably about 7 or so last year in Botswana. In Marrakesh, Morocco, we had maybe 2. So it just kind of depends. But we feel very good about the turnout we had from across the continent, really.
Help us unpack that in terms of what the vision and what a successful outcome of that theme looks like at this conference.
Right. So I think what we have learned over the years is that if you are going to grow trade and investment and business, commercial engagement between the United States and any of its partners around the world, but particularly in Africa, you have to have the public and the private sector coming together. And you have to have both sides, of the Atlantic, both on the U.S. side and the African side, really engaged. Now, we're here for 3 or 4 days, and that's wonderful. But what really is driving this is what happens outside of the summit. And so CCA throughout the year and throughout the years, our 30 years of existence, there is an ongoing engagement. And we are seen as the premier U.S. business association that has the convening power to actually get African heads of state, heads of U.S. government agencies. We've even had the President of the United States on different occasions who have been at our summit. So we're doing, I think, not just, we're focused on sustainable partnership, not just for these 3 days as a theme for the summit, but in an ongoing day-to-day way. And many of our member companies, we have about 120 U.S. and African members, multinationals, as well as SMEs, who on a regular basis are engaging with each other.
Right.
And the last thing I'll say is that the summit is really the ground for promoting and facilitating that engagement. People tell us all the time, I met this particular person at your last summit. And after your summit, we then sat down and started engaging, and now we have started a joint venture.
All right.
Yeah, no, and we hear this all the time, all the time. So we're excited about that, the day-to-day business engagement that happens because CCA was actually able to convene people and bring them together.
Since 2017, and as you look at the picture right now, in terms of interests, areas of mutual interest for the US and Africa, would you say that it's growing or is it waning? And I ask against a backdrop of the common view that is being put on the table right now, that Africa is also gathering a whole lot more new friends coming from China, new friends coming from Russia, new friends even coming from the Middle East. How would you describe the relationship right now between the US and Africa?
So, there are 2 points here. First of all, Africa has been partnering with a range of bilateral countries and partners over the years. The United States has had long-term relationships with many of the African nations. Some of them are now celebrating their 50th year of anniversary of their independence, 60 years of independence. And the U.S. has been engaging with a range of countries across the continent. Trade. We've also been trading and investing with African nations. We have CCA members who have been in Africa a long time. I was just in a panel where the woman from Coca-Cola was saying that they have been in Africa now for 96 years, I believe. We have companies, Caterpillar, Procter & Gamble, Pfizer, they've been there a long time. And so, we're not new to the continent, but then we have members like Amazon and Google who are newer to NBA Africa, who are members who are newer to the continent and engaged in creative economy, sports as a business. So my view is the Africans are partnering with other folks, and that's fine.
All right.
They've been partnering with us. We would like to do more. That's what we want to focus on. We're not asking for them to choose us versus anybody else. We're just looking at what can we do to enhance the U.S. Africa relationship. How can we promote more business? How can we promote more trade? How can we create more jobs?
Sure.
Right? And so I think that that's important. Now, in terms of the other part of the question, from 2017 to now, of course, the pandemic, the COVID pandemic, set Africa back. It was really, difficult for them. Though, frankly, the predictions that people had for what was going to happen in Africa during that pandemic were not realized, thank God. And so we continued we had a virtual summit in 2021. We had 6 African heads of state who joined us from wherever they were on the continent. We had 5 members of the Biden cabinet that joined us virtually in 2021. But one of the things that I want to talk about that's happened over these years is that all of the disruptions that we saw in global supply chains, now people are looking at Africa as a place where they can diversify their supply chains and not basically be dependent on a few factories in a few countries for critical things like semiconductors. Before the COVID pandemic, and I'll end here, before the COVID pandemic, I don't think there were any companies who would say that Africa was going to be producing mRNA vaccines. But guess what? We have companies like Pfizer and Johnson & Johnson, which are members of CCA, who are partnering with African companies, including in South Africa.
Aspen.
Yes, Aspen, to produce mRNA vaccines.
Sure.
And so, yes, there was a downside and a negative impact of COVID, but I actually think that there's some things that have happened since COVID and because of that pandemic that are beneficial for Africa. People are looking at, can we produce more automobiles in Africa? Can we produce more pharmaceutical products and medical devices in Africa? I mean, there's a shifting that's going on, and I like that. People looking at the continent in terms of the opportunities it offers, especially now that the African Continental Free Trade Area Agreement
Sure.
has been adopted by all but one African country.
Do U.S. companies know about that? And what is their sort of reception and their level of interest in trading under the AfCFTA?
Fifi, I'm glad you asked that. CCA works very closely with a number of U.S. government agencies. One of them that we're working with is Prosper Africa. And under a Prosper Africa agreement, CCA is educating U.S. companies about the AfCFTA, what it means, $1.3 billion market, right? Free trade moving across the entire continent of Africa. If you're a U.S. investor and you're trying to decide where to go, you can invest in any of the African countries now and access the entire continent. And we've been educating people through a series of webinars and in-person events on what are the advantages of AfCFTA.
Sure.
And the most recent one we did was an in-person event with the Secretary General, Kele Mene, who's here, on the digital trade protocol that they just adopted in February. And we're going to try and do another one on the Women in Trade protocol that was also adopted in February. So yes, U.S. companies are being educated about the African continent, the market that it presents for them, and the ways that they can take advantage of that.
For those who are watching and just wondering about the opportunity right now, just based on your engagement with members of the CCA, based on your engagement, of course, with a lot of companies that are already in Africa right now, vice versa, what would you tell them about what the opportunity pipeline does look like?
Oh, well, I think that this is a perfect time to be looking at Africa. You know, if you are trying to grow your bottom line, there's no better market to look at, in my view, than Africa.
Sure.
It has some of the fastest growing economies in the world. It has a youth population that is the largest in the world. That means that in terms of consumers, but also in terms of tapping that labor market, the young people of Africa who are incredible, right? And so, yes, this is a perfect time to look at Africa, perfect time to look at growing your business on the continent. And also, I believe that the U.S. government is through a variety of programs coming out of the U.S. Africa Leaders Summit that happened in 2022,
Sure.
and the business forum that we co-hosted, CCA co-hosted in 2022. The U.S. government is doing a lot of things to support greater U.S. investment in and trade with Africa. And we had here this week Chair Rita Jo Lewis of the U.S. Export-Import Bank. We had, you know, the number 2 person from the U.S. Development Finance Corporation, the head of the Millennium Challenge Corporation, the head of the U.S. Trade and Development Agency, and so many others, the head of the U.S. Africa Development Foundation. So I'm just, you know, shouting out for the U.S. government and what it's doing. And last but not least, there's the African government. I was privileged to be in a session yesterday evening on U.S. trade and investment where we had ministers from 5 or 6 different African countries who were talking about what they're doing to take advantage of the African Growth and Opportunity Act and the kinds of incentives that they're putting in place, as well as the enabling environment, right? Our companies are ready to invest, but sometimes the regulations and the red tape might get in the way. And I want to applaud the African nations as well for trying to remove some of those challenges and to focus on what they can do to make the enabling environment, not just for U.S. companies, but for their own companies and African companies across the continent to really do business in those individual nations. And I think that, you know, this is a great time for us to really hold up the light and shine a positive a light on Africa and the U.S.-Africa business relationship and relationship overall. I think that this is a good time for us to look at that.
And that concludes today's episode of Focus On, coming to you from Dallas, Texas, of course. From myself, Fifi Peters, thanks so much for watching, as always, and we'll do it again next time.